Welcome, everyone, to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea Podcast's Radiohead Retrospective, where we go through the discography of one of the most important rock bands to ever do it. And we last week did the sophomore effort, The Bends, had a great discussion on that. Go check out the first two episodes of it if you haven't seen it yet, because it's very important contextually where we arrive at today, because we are discussing a monolithic record today. We are talking about their third album, OK Computer. And I think it is a fair assessment to say that this very well might be the biggest album we have ever talked about on this podcast, relatively speaking.
I would say that is unquestionable in terms of cultural significance. It's a pretty fucking important record. I think really the only record that could be fairly labeled to be more important to Western modern music is maybe Sgt. Pepper's by the Beatles. But Radiohead almost feels like more fitting for us to be talking about Radiohead because they're so much more baked into a lot of our own kind of musical interests and tastes. So yeah, I mean, that's part of the many reasons why we're doing this Radiohead retrospective. One of the other reasons that you'll be aware of if you watch their previous videos is that we want to give a kind of fresh take on these records, like not be too swept up in the hype. And that should really, it's kind of important to emphasize that here more than ever, but also difficult as well, because this is such a record that has been talked about so much. I can't pretend that we're going to have anything original to say, but I'm hoping that we'll have some entertaining thoughts to give. And I'm hoping that we can get to the bottom of this record in a way that is interesting and that helps us to continue to tell the story of Radiohead in this continuous way that we're doing it. OK Computer. So we talked about the Bends last week as a progression from Pablo Honey in terms of the band both refining their alt rock sound as well as getting more ambitious in their compositions, in their chord progressions, and their arrangements, and Tom York's vocal performances. In basically every respect, you basically have to say that that the Bends was a more ambitious, more focused, and more interesting record than Pablo Honey. So Radiohead are essentially at this position after coming off of the Bends, where all eyes are basically on them. I mean, as that they were in that position going into the Bends as well with the success of Creep, but the quickness with which Radiohead achieved fame really meant that their finding of their sound was happening in real time in the spotlight, and that the developments that were happening between records were incredibly dramatic because it was a combination of both having to find your sound in this really nascent period when you really haven't been a band for that long, and also when there's this incredible weight on you on the basis of hype and expectations and of this new cultural place that you're sitting in where you're so different and so distant from other bands that you're connected to in purely aesthetic ways or in scene ways, like the britpop comparisons that came up with regard to the Bends. And so more pressure, I would argue, is on Radiohead than ever before to craft a statement that distinguishes themselves and fully answers the question of who they are. They certainly got closer to understanding and defining that with the Bends. But as we talked about in our discussion of that album, there were still some growing pains. Tom York's lyrical interests as a writer we're still expanding outward and we're getting more interesting and ambitious, but also it had moments where they retreated into some of the more youthful concerns of their early stuff. And so OK Computer comes at a point where Tom and Johnny and everyone in the band is seeking to refine all of the things that they've already demonstrated that they're good at even further and push beyond to the point where where they can't really be compared to anything or pigeonholed in any specific straightforward way. They reunite with producer Nigel Godrich, who actually only produced one song on the Bends, Black Star. That most of the majority of that record, as you will remember, was produced by John Leckie. But they reunite with Nigel Godrich, and they kind of self-produce it alongside him. So Radiohead, the members of Radiohead are as involved in the production process as Nigel is. He kind of oversees and helps them. And that has been the arrangement that Radiohead have stuck to on every single release since this album, without exception. And that's an ongoing creative relationship that we'll be able to continue exploring as well. The recording process for OK Computer was protracted and took place over almost a year, I think, from mid 1996 to early 1997. I talked about Tom York's growing interest in expanding the topics that he sort of covers in terms of his lyricism, and the notion of Radiohead having specific interests in specific topics. And in that sense, OK Computer is a heavily conceptual record that focuses around a number of key themes and ideas that have to do with basically existence in the modern world, the increasing encroachment of technology into the everyday lives of normal people, the blatant ugliness of consumerism and the way it kind of feeds into that changing technological landscape, the sense of alienation and isolation that a lot of people were feeling at this time, where they were beginning to grow apart and distant from the comparatively, I guess, more intimate decades that preceded the 90s, thanks to this rise in technology and this changing landscape. And all of these are reflected in the interests and the topics that Tom sings about on this record, and in the arrangements that the band composed to support these songs. There's a lot to be said about the recording process for this record, a lot of really interesting details. As we'll be able to discuss, it is an incredibly busy album. There is a lot happening in the songs in this record. They're incredibly complex, dense in their mixes, and the band utilize a lot of techniques of recording that add particular flavors to particular tracks. For instance, the natural reverb that you hear on, or the reverb that you hear on Tom's vocals in the song Exit Music, for instance, was achieved naturally by recording his voice directly, intimately in a staircase. And more pointedly as well, to, I guess, emphasize the band's harmony, or to add a real sense of liveliness to the performances on this record. This album was performed without audio separation, so it was performed without recording the instruments as separate stems. All of the songs were recorded live together, which gives this record compared to the Bends, which obviously was a very warm and organic and dynamic sounding record. This record sounds even more busy and buzzing and hefty and weighty. So OK Computer arrived very fully formed and with a lot of anticipation to the world on the 21st of May 1997, totally incidentally 6 weeks after I was born. And it, interestingly, was not preceded by a single. There are 4 singles released in association with this record, all of which followed the release of the album, the first of which we'll touch on in a minute. So basically, listeners' first exposure to this new world that Radiohead were bringing to them was with the opening track of this record, which is called Airbag. And getting away from just the iconicness of this song as an introduction for the record for a second, it is, especially when you compare it to the ways in which Pablo Honey and the Bends kind of almost gently ease you into their definitive new worlds. Airbag arrives kind of in medias res, like it arrives kind of halfway through itself, like it arrives in the middle of this kind of really strange ascending descending riff that is then kind of piled on top of by the incredibly dense mix and arrangement. And one thing I want to make reference to is when we discussed the bends, we talked about the closure of that record, Street Spirit, and I described the mood of that song as funereal, feeling like a song about death and dying. And therefore it's meaningful that I think OK Computer opens with essentially a rebirth, ironically in the context of a devastating automobile accident. In the next world war, in a jackknifed juggernaut, I am born again. In the neon signs scrolling up and down, I am born again. In an interstellar burst, I'm back to save the universe. So you're immediately thrown into this. And I think it's meaningful that the song starts in the way it does, so suddenly, because it's meant to simulate that suddenness of the collision, the car collision that the song is about, and the way in which it brings this narrator who is in this state of basically stasis, of emptiness, brings him roaring back to life essentially, and serves as this point that the album kind of balloons out of, and is interestingly also worth noting autobiographical to a certain extent, because Tom York was in an automobile accident and survived because of an airbag. So it introduces that interesting autobiographical element that lends a potency to this scene that he's setting and what it represents in this album. Anyway, what do you guys think of Airbag, the song, and how it opens this record and what it is as a declarative statement of purpose?
I one of the things I really like about it is how you sort of have records like this, like OK Computer, and you come out with that whole the conceit of it about the impending sort of wave of humanity's reliance on technology, and you can even see it as sort of a precursor to talk about things like the internet and all that kind of stuff. And I think there's lots of really like foreboding things about this, that a lot of art in the 90s became a lot more relevant than maybe it was even intended to become. And all of the good stuff like that has, it's aged really well, and I think this is one of those things. It does handle it in such a way, in this whole like airbag scenario, like the airbag saving Tom's life being the first indication of technology saving somebody's life. It's us being literally reliant on technology, and that's sort of like, I'm guessing that if Tom actually experienced that, it was kind of a bit of an epiphany perhaps. And the cool thing about this song though is that it's just so like exciting. That's the thing about OK Computer, is that for all of its bleakness, for all of its occasional like sterility, it's so like captivating and immediately arresting. You have these like nothing on this album sounds like it's completely unprecedented. Like I think that Street Spirits may be a good indicator for lots of songs on here, very specifically some that appear later in the track list. But like, my God, when you sort of like thrown into that riff, and then immediately Tom's got that really hook, an interstellar burst, I'm back to save the universe. And you're just kind of like, it's not like a fast song, but it's really like energized, and you're just kind of like, okay, fucking yeah, let's fucking go. And you're just immediately hit with that density and like how layered everything is, and those like really lumbering guitars. And it's so strange and inviting, and it's just does everything that an opening track can be. Like it's very much the Planet Telex of this album, and it serves that purpose, but it also serves the purpose in the respect that it's like also just like a better song almost. It's a little bit sparse lyrically, which is not an inherently bad thing, but it basically makes up for it, in my opinion, with like the sonic density, and it just really sets the tone for the album in almost like sucker punch kind of way, because like the rest of the album doesn't really, like, the approach is the same, but the actual palette that it draws from, not particularly.
It's kind of like this big, it's the most, one of the most maximalist tracks I think Radiohead have ever made, in terms of just like, there's at
Totally.
any given moment in the song there might be a dozen different things going on. The way that drums are clipped and looped and distorted, the way that layers of guitars are processed in various different ways. There is like a space rock tonality to some of the guitars at certain points here that carries across parts of the records as well. I definitely agree that there's no other song on this album that sounds quite like it. But in many ways, it's kind of like providing you with a preview of almost everything that the rest of the album is going to deliver to you in more refined ways. And maybe that could be an argument as to this track being too busy or too overwhelming, but I don't feel that that comes across. And I think that's where maybe the lyrical sparseness of this track is perhaps a plus, because it's less that it's lyrically sparse and it's more that it's just the sentiment is refined, and Tom doesn't try to compete with the instrumentation of the song too much. Like there are moments where his voice, like towards the end of the song, his voice just kind of comes soaring in over top of those roaring guitars, and he's just not even like saying words at that point. He's just kind of vocalizing, and then the instrumental is kind of harmonizing with him in spirit and in sound, and it's beautiful combinations.
This is my first exposure to the vast majority of Radiohead's discography, 8 out of the 9 albums. And what I can say about Airbag is that when I first heard it, I was like, wow, this is the best song they've ever made. And I was like, wow. And by the end of the album, it wasn't. And it's really just
so true, King.
It's an astonishingly great opening. I love the way it almost feels like the song that should end the album in a way, because it really feels like the circle being complete here, in that most of the album is about the dependence on technology, but this song is about the destruction of technology to save one's life, in a sense. A car being totaled so that an airbag deploys, ruining the vehicle but saving you. And I think that's an interesting contrast to a lot of the other lyrical themes and ideas across this album.
And this is something I won't talk about it now, but I'll save it till we talk about the closing track on this record. But this album is essentially circular. Like it basically at the exact point it ends is the exact point it starts thematically in terms of its broad ideas and story, and it comes full circle in a really nice way. And I agree, this, like, I use the word kind of in medias res, it almost doesn't feel like an opener, but that immediacy of it, that suddenness of it, and that coherent, clear, conclusive idea of it is kind of so stark and so surprising and so takes you off guard, that it's a nice encapsulation of like what Radiohead are trying to do with this album as a whole, to launch forward and to surprise and to stun. And I think, you know, we'll debate the merits of Radiohead songs and how we differ in opinion from time to time, but it's like, it's so unequivocally clear when you listen to Airbag that it's so much more sophisticated and detailed and ambitious than any song they'd ever made before it. And it works because of the focus of it, the grounding of it, and those core ideas, and the ways in which the busy instrumentation isn't just this effect that's put in the song to make it seem huge and larger than life. It's there to reflect the chaos of the event that it's depicting, and to reflect the, you know, thematic relevance of that to the album you're about to experience. Like, it really does feel like you're, as soon as that riff comes in at the start, it's like you're in that auto accident, and all of the bells and whistles in the song are all of the bits of twisted metal that are flying glass that are flying up around you. It's just great marriage of sound design and theme.
York's vocals too are like, it's like a soundtrack to like feeling the crash in slow motion. Like the chorus, like, and that image are just like superimposed in my mind now.
What it reminds me of, if we can talk about the influences on one of the most influential albums of all time for a second, is not just lyrically, but in terms of forward-thinking innovation, as well as lyrics, which really make it a very direct parallel almost, is certain tracks on David Bowie's Low, in particular, Always Crashing in the Same Car, which is a similarly lyrically sparse song, which is only kind of about actually a car crash, but I mean, you can fucking argue that Airbag is only kind of about a car crash.
Yeah.
Is that sort of the detail on this song and the detail in something like Airbag is so like it's interesting to think of something so lyrically sparse, but still so compelling, despite that sparseness, and a lot of that is down to the music, and but not just the music, even just the sound of it. The influence of Brian Eno on Airbag is immeasurable, and I very much feel like this is like a low for the millennial Gen X era,
The other Brian
and it's
Eno
just
projection
fucking
I would bring up in relation to this album in terms of the way that it sounds and the way that sounds are structured and the way that Brian Eno uses space to give eclectic busy mixes more weight is Remain in Light, and his production on that record specifically. I think is another reference point. I think you're totally bang on that Nigel and the band are drawing from the way that he approached and looked at sound and sounds in relation to each other. Another reference point I want to bring up at this point is good coming up at this point as any point. I'll probably come back to it throughout the record. It's a little more abstract, and I have to say I didn't really pick up on it until I read about it. But a heavily influential record on the recording of this album that the band were listening to a lot while they were making it, and that they used as a model for how this album sounds is Bitches Brew by Miles Davis. That is a record where you're introducing the language and sounds of rock into the world of jazz. You're intertwining them. You're creating these huge monolithic compositions where like 8 things are happening at the same time together, and they're doing and that was a model for this record. And even the specific prominence of electric piano on that album, a very kind of core jazz fusion staple, is found in some of the electric piano playing on this record too, on songs like Subterranean, Homesick, Alien, for instance. I mean, we could just do this episode just talking about the way the mixes on these songs sound, because they're so unprecedented for this band and for rock music in general. Like, yeah, there are reference points that it draws from, but it's all happening contextually in such a different and alien way here, which I think is totally part of the point, right? Like the alienness of it and the hectic quality of it is meant to immerse you in that state of mind of this protagonist, or of Tom, who is completely surrounded by and inured to and subject to a world, an alien world essentially, that is frightening and terrifying. So yeah, so that's how Radiohead bring you into this world, in a very confronting way. And what do they do from there? Well, now we get to the actual lead single of the record, which, I mean, as far as lead singles go, I mean, the gigantic balls this band have. Paranoid Android, the early centerpiece of this very early centerpiece of this album. It's not obviously not the centerpiece, but it is, like, in a sense, maybe the most representative and well-known track on the record. It's certainly one of the most enduring, one of the most influential, and one of the most iconic. What it often gets compared to is the Bohemian Rhapsody, which I think is kind of a facile comparison. Like, yeah, I mean, these are 6-minute radio singles that move through various parts, some of which are so starkly different from other parts, but I don't know.
Well, the songs don't serve, like, even within the context of themselves and not the albums they're on. It's night and fucking day. They're not even in the same stratosphere.
Before we get too far into this, Tom York has said himself that Bohemian Rhapsody is an influence on the song, but he follows that with saying It's 50% Bohemian Rhapsody and 50% Happiness is a Warm Gun off of the White
Okay,
Album.
well, right.
So,
That's
like it's more than that.
No, you're
Yeah.
right to bring that up. I didn't realize he'd cited that.
Totally.
More what I mean is that the comparisons people make with this song, relevant or not, like fear or not, kind of get away from the actual experience of the song itself, which is so singular and so unique. It moves through obviously various different sections, some of which are really kind of jazzy in terms of the progressions, some of which are really, really kind of like raucous and loud. And that's thanks to Johnny's incredibly innovative guitar playing on this track, which is both raucous and heavy, and also like in that loud section of the track where you hear like this wheezing sound that sounds like mechanical breathing as well. Like he has these layers of absolutely bizarre and off the wall guitar mechanics going on in this track, and also a way in which it is jazz like is the frequently shifting tempos as well. Parts of it are in 4/4, parts of it are in 7/8. Phil Selway's drumming is really strange and offbeat, and there's shakers on this track. There's a lot of instrumental bells and whistles that add to the density of it. It is essentially a building on that core central theme of your state of mind in this incredibly hectic and alien world that we've been talking about. A sense of being kind of drowned out and unable to focus. It's almost like it's almost surreal, the different combinations of imagery and scenes that are set in this song. It evokes very much that idea that Tom York has spoken of a lot, of like writing individual lines and then kind of just piecing them together in a surreal way to provide an image rather than a clear, coherent narrative.
How many sections would you say this song even fucking has? Like, I'd say there's probably like at least 4 or 5 distinct movements in it. It's constructed of pretty simple things, but yet it is like one of the most atmospheric things on here. Like those like ethereal cascading guitars at the beginning where it's just kind of like you feel enraptured by everything. And you said that it's like lyrically it sort of builds like this scene. For me, the song always was about, or at least the song is really more the building of a character. Like in this sort of bleak dystopic sort of world that the album presents, is that this is like the mindset of your average citizen, the sort of I'm trying to I'm trying to get some rest, but all the voices inside my head, and they're obviously like these incredibly strange phrases and these like near schizophrenic musings of just going like bird fetuses inside my head and that shit. Tom really fucking likes going back to that one. But and it's like just these sort of like phrases that this character, this average person in this this environment would say, and sort of their attitude and their inflections and the way it's so erratic, kind of reflecting their mindset. It's like you have that like robot voice in the chorus where Tom's just doing that really good like holding on that note of like the what's that, and then you hear like the I am horrible, and you're just like, what the fuck is that shit? And then midway through, there's that guitar that's just so fucking distorted. You're just like, whoa, holy shit. And it's just an incredibly exciting song. Like, it's just one of the most interesting, innovative rock songs I think that's ever been recorded. And I think that it's like, it's bizarrely accessible too. Like when I first started to listen to this album, this was one of the songs I always came back to. And it's just because it's like it feels like you're listening to a suite. And it rules. It's one of the best songs on the album. Kind of begins a streak of basically perfect songs.
Tom specifically stated that this song was inspired by experiencing a scene in a bar in LA where he was surrounded by strangers who were high and witnessing this incredibly violent altercation between a woman and a man who spilled a drink on her. And basically, this scene, like a number of songs on this record, kind of get at this idea of like some violent or ugly thing completely setting you into a state of panic. And the song is essentially like inducing this panic attack state in the listener. The title, of course, is a reference to Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the character of Marvin, the paranoid android. And one of kind of a number of like interstellar space literate references on this record. And it's kind of like the narrator of the song kind of goes a bit insane, and kind of just gets into the state of panic and kind of like boils over. I love that classic line of, when I'm king, you'll be first against the wall with your opinion, which is of no consequence at all. And he just kind of
York logging on to film Twitter.
And he just kind of gets into this suspended state of mania that then beautifully melds into this kind of depressive midsection where he's kind of like, he switches from being aggressive towards this environment to kind of despairing of it and saying, yeah, fine, just rain down on me, like fine, just... He eventually like loses his ability to withstand it and just kind of collapses. And then the final part of the song, he's not even singing it. It's just the frenzied guitar of Johnny returning. It's an immaculately constructed song.
This leads into what I wanted to talk about this song in particular. Often described as sort of describing a dystopia, and aptly so, especially when you learn where the inspiration for it came from, particularly in those lines describing the woman at the bar and the sort of violent moment that came out of that. I guess I guess dystopia still applies when it's not like, somewhere in the future, because, the dystopia that he's talking about is just the one that we live in. Like in the state of affairs all over the world in 1997, and which has not lost an ounce of relevance now. If anything, things have gotten weirder.
And part of it as well is like part of what makes it so easy to connect with is that I think basically all of these songs are written by Tom in first person perspective. So yeah, he's talking, you can see them as songs representing his own perspective, like Paranoid Android is as well. But whatever he's trying to sing about, he is like immersing you in it through that lyrical style.
I mean, from my perspective, at least, I never even considered looking at it through the lens of a like dystopia. I just always was like, yeah, okay, he's just describing the state of affairs as they are.
Should just be like that.
Yeah, and I mean, in that sense, I definitely, I like the track to some degree, but I do have some reservations where I'm like, yeah, I also definitely know the version of me who would have like really loved this track and connected with it on a very deep level. And I also want to kick the shit out of that version of me. So it
the Morgan Creep dilemma.
Yeah, kind of. It lends a bit of that into my feelings, for as nebulous as that may be.
Are there particular aspects of the song that irk you?
I guess what annoys me a little is like the whole viewing other people as they're just like they're just in the step, they're just marching to the tune or whatnot. And I don't know if that's like, if the song's being like almost ironic and making fun of the person who's thinking that way, or like if it's empathizing with that person, I guess is my disconnect at the moment.
It's kind of ambiguous, I think, because there's a sense in which it is this exasperated despair at people, and there's also a sense in which it is a kind of self-loathing portrait of a reaction to that. And yeah, it is very kind of like emotionally overwrought, but I think it's true to the experience of that kind of manic state of being. But yeah, I can now that you've said that, I can see what you mean.
Yeah.
Well, so the record opens with these two incredibly bombastic songs. And then we go into the first of a couple of more, I won't say ballads because it's not a ballad really. It has this surging climactic part during its chorus, but it is one of the less discussed songs on this record, which I find interesting. The song Subterranean, Homesick, Alien, which of course in its title is a reference to the Bob Dylan song Subterranean Homesick Blues. And the song, again, I think builds upon this idea of alienation in the world that you live in and the desire to escape that, specifically by manifesting an alien encounter in the context of the stories. You have these incredible electric pianos in this song and these really kind of like classic Radiohead sounding kind of watery guitar tones that hang all throughout the song and give it this really kind of spacey feel that seems to me to be in perfect concert with the images the song is portraying, the scene, the idea, the metaphor of the alien encounter. And now it is very, on the nose and very direct, but it's also, there's an honesty and a truthfulness and a real earnestness to it that's I find moving and contrasts really nicely with the kind of eruption of the chorus, of the repetition of uptight, uptight, they're uptight, I'm uptight. It's outwardly critical in a similar way that Paranoid Android is, but it's also like retreats inward into self-loathing in a way that that song kind of hinted at. And I think what the idea that this gets across, that maybe to August the previous song didn't as cogently, is the idea that this reaction to the world, this bitterness, this mania, this hatred, is not something that is a kind of rebellious defiance of that world, but a product of it. Like, it makes you hate it. It makes you hate yourself. It makes you hate everything. And it engineers this state of mind where you are basically so full of despair and loathing that you would basically, if you couldn't be dead, you would at least want to not be on this planet anymore. And it literalizes that feeling. And I think it does that in a really effective way.
It also sort of focuses on the desire to see a positive in the world. The take me on board their beautiful ship, show me the world as I'd love to see it, instead of the everything's bad, everyone's bad, but yuppies network and that Paranoid Android occasionally fell into. Musically, Johnny and Ed Greenwood, Johnny Greenwood and Ed O'Brien are doing some just fucking mystifying stuff with the guitar here.
Yeah, it's a beautiful mix. It is, and we must continue to shout out as well the rhythm section of the band here too. The way that particularly Phil in this song, he surges in his drums during that chorus in a way that really kind of like, as those arpeggiated guitars are kind of frenzying as well, and Tom's voice is soaring. It really communicates that sense of intensity that comes with the shifting away from the beautiful fantasy to the harsh reality of confronting how you really are in this moment in time, the uptightness and it's and again, some of Tom's most kind of beautiful picturesque lyricism here. The breath of the morning I keep forgetting, the smell of the warm summer air, that idea, that kind of idyllic sense of wanting to be able to commune with the world in a way that you once could, but now for a variety of reasons are unable to do. It's just a really affecting song and some really beautiful lyricism here too.
I've never heard this song talked about, and at least everyone who I have heard talk about it kind of refers to it in lesser lights, even if they do think it's great. So I guess I'll come in and say this has always been one of my favorite songs on the record, just because, like, I mean, when I first heard it, I had never heard a song like this before, ever. Like, the way it just sort of builds that in just absolutely incredible fucking atmosphere with those guitars is just unreal. And you just get this great, I always love, like, I know it's an homage, but the Subterranean Homesick Alien is such a really vivid picture to paint, and it's also kind of like oxymoronic in a way that kind of makes sense. and you sort of like, you're trying to see the beauty in the world, but you're kind of constantly surrounded by just the coldness of it. And that's sort of what the song feels like, is that it's kind of juxtaposed this iciness but also this sort of like ethereal beauty. So it's like it's cold and almost uninviting, but also kind of like mystical sounding. And that sort of contrast is just so like perfect for what the song is going for thematically. And I always loved how it sort of communicated that. Is like, it's like, I think it's pretty like nuanced. Like, yeah, I think Paranoid Android's pretty straightforward, but this is also just like, you have that desire to just be like, oh, all these, these people, they're different from me and I'm just isolated and building up all these barriers. But also you're just like, yeah, but that's fucking, I don't want to be that person. I want to see the beauty in the world. I want something to like give me this new perspective. And I want like to be able to see everything that I already see, but like it. And goddamn, relatable ass sentiment, because I would also too like for aliens to come down and be like, hey, world ain't so bad. Look at it. Ain't that beautiful? Because I'm just like, goddamn, what, everything sucks. Are we all gonna die? Oh Jesus. But yeah, I really do love this song. I think it's I guess I have like weirder favorites than most people do on this album. Even if, like, one can have them because everybody loves every song, but I do genuinely think that this is one of the better songs on the album. Definitely in the top half of my ranking.
So at this point in the record, we get a slightly different song. Exit music for a film was actually originally written for Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet movie. They specifically asked the band to write a song for that movie. We're not going to talk about the movie. There's no point talking about the movie because I don't really think that,
Nope.
aside from that detail, the song really has anything to do with it or is any really related to it at all, aside from what initially drove them to write it, because it is completely in concert with a lot of the ideas that this record talks about, but it situates those ideas in a way that's very different from the songs that precede it. It is a much more specific story of a couple who are basically in this situation where they are, it's ambiguous whether they're actually escaping, whether they're actually evading some kind of threat from her father, or whether it's a kind of double suicide situation is a kind of ambiguous implication as well that I've heard applied to this song. It's very difficult to talk about this song in relation to the way that the other songs work, because it is written in such a very incredibly personalized way, and with these kind of direct images that are almost kind of surprising to hear Tom writing a song in this way. And it also, the structure of the song is, again, like many other tracks on this record that we've already talked about and that we'll continue to talk about, an interesting advancement and ambitious undertaking for Radiohead. It is this gentle acoustic haunted ballad at the start. It opens with just those very haunted vocals that I talked about being recorded in a staircase. Lends it this very kind of isolating, cold quality to it. The acoustic strumming is very muted as well. There's, I believe, the use of a mellotron in this song that comes in and eventually, which is an interesting inclusion. And eventually the song begins to swell and it has this kind of really ecstatic climax of like incredibly emotional proportions, and then ends on a very haunted note, not dissimilar to how it started. I'd love to dig more into what the song is about, but I want to hear from you all first in terms of how this song strikes you, what you think of it, and how you think it relates to the rest of the album.
No point burying the lead here. This is my favorite Radiohead song. I've always like, I listened to it in isolation. This is one of the first Radiohead songs I ever heard, and I was enamored with it. I actually used it for a short film that I made with Morgan once upon a time. And I sort of like used it for this moment, and I always was kind of taken aback by the fact that it's sort of, has that for a film parenthetical in it. And so it always felt inherently cinematic to me. And I didn't know about the whole Romeo and Juliet thing, but like, I was just sort of enamored with it from a musical perspective, just because it's so, it starts off so intimate and then becomes so forlorn and kind of anxiety inducing. Those like harmonized vocals that sort of appear in the middle of the song, those they sound so like eerie and kind of like stiff. Like, I mean, it sounds like a choir of fucking robots. That doesn't sound human,
Yeah.
but like, and that's, you know, it falls in line with the sound. But it was only really in the context of the album that I really grew to like really, really love this song as much as I do. And I think it's that it presents like, you know, that OK Computer's building this world, and yeah, it could be a reflection, it could be this dystopia, it could be the modern world, but the environment that it builds is this very bleak, sort of just almost overbearing sense of like claustrophobia, and it's like inundating you with this. You have, you know, songs that have this like busy ideas and a lot going on, and it's just kind of like really getting at you. Even the more relaxed last track kind of leaves you a little bit more breathing room. But here, the context of like the story of like these two like lovers, you know, pack and get dressed and they leave and they're like runaways. There's so much to this story in the context of the album of like, maybe they're trying to escape the world that they feel like is trying to overtake them. And the sort of ambiguity of what happens to them is also what I think really makes the song special, in that it's part of it has always rung to me is like when there's a part of the song like towards the very end, like kind of past the middle section, where kind of what sounds like a field recording comes in, and you sort of hear like this environment happening, kind of sounds like a playground or like you're in a city or something. You hear like children in the distance, and for some reason it always conjured to mind for me like the image of like these of the couple in the song like running away, and they're like in an overpass hiding as like the world kind of bustles on around them. And maybe at the end of this song, maybe they're in denial and maybe they die. Maybe they don't have anything and they're just trying to run away and they don't have food or whatever. Maybe they do actually escape. Maybe this is the one ray of hope from this like overwhelming jaws of the modern world, and they actually do get to escape. But we don't actually know. And I love that about it. And not to mention, I just sonically, this is such a fucking compelling song. It's got that dun, 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 at the very beginning that's just like this really interesting, just like it's so strange to hear something so simple at the beginning of this album or the beginning of this song, just because the album hasn't been like this. And the way it builds and ebbs and flows from its different parts, it's just beautiful the whole way through. And that sort of end where it sort of finally does sound like a song that's actually on this album, where it sounds more like, you know, the guitars kind of got this like reverb on it. It sounds like it's echoing into a fucking like an insanely large empty building, and you sort of have that really big euphoric rise at the end. It's like this sort of emotional timbre that this has, it could be this overwhelming dread, it could be this consuming thing, or it could be this euphoric escape. And the way it rides that line, that walks that edge of that razor, is so fucking perfect. It could be triumphant, it could be disastrous, it could be anything. On different days I hear this song and I could feel like crying, or I could feel like I'm, you know, escaping a horrid monstrosity of nightmarish fucking scale. And I love it. It's like the perfect combination of impressionistic and vivid, and it's like so emblematic of this whole album to me and why I love it and OK Computer as a whole.
I mean, yeah, I mean, the thing about this album is that it is essentially a tapestry of this world, and it is attempting to capture various phenomena, various things that happen, various emotions that are experienced, various ways of existing in this world. And we've had songs so far about the overwhelming nature of the technology in the world, the overwhelming nature of the incredibly busy and cluttered and clustered and frantic nature of the world. And you have at this point this really poignant story that encapsulates a much more personal aspect of the way that this world is experienced. And so like this record throws a bunch of curveballs, I think, and this is one of them, and it's one of the most, I guess, simply effective ones. And the fact that this song is on this record, as opposed to just being a song that they wrote for a movie that's a B-side or whatever, is meaningful and adds some extra necessary emotional gravity and I guess a realness to the world that we've seen so far. You go from these emotionally outpouring tracks that precede it to this steely resolve on this song to escape, to move out of it, whether or not that's fruitless. But there's just a resolve here that comes hardened out of the fragility of the songs that precede it. And it's a great piece of sequencing in that regard as well.
It's like it's so cool because it could be the most triumphant song on the album, or it could be the bleakest. It has that sort of versatility to like the ending phrase of like, we hope that you choke. It could be the embittered, steely resolve of two people escaping the things that they felt confined or oppressed them, and then just, a final fuck you to these people. Or it could be them in their final breaths, just sort of lamenting and fruitlessly saying that they want these forces that held them captive to choke and die. And it's just it's so emotionally poignant for so many different reasons, and it's a very cinematic song, no pun intended, but like it is.
Yeah, like that sentiment, we hope that you choke, is a very kind of like, it's a stark and startling and unsettling line. And it's a sort of thing that's said as a kind of fuck you. But the way that Tom sings it in this really hoarse, fragile, almost like whisper that almost undercuts the way you would normally interpret it, and it does plant the seed of ambiguity into the scene and into the ending of the story. Do they really get away? And the point, I think, of the story is that it's about the desire and the drive and the will to escape, but whether they do or not depends on whether they can overcome the thing that they're escaping. And this record as a whole is about the overwhelmingness of the forces that make you want to escape and that make it so difficult, if not impossible, to escape. So what's interesting about, again, another interesting piece of sequencing is this song flowing effortlessly into Let Down, which is, what's interesting is that like Exit Music is maybe the most kind of like emotionally forthright and like heart on sleeve song on the record. And then Let Down has the line, "Don't get sentimental, it always ends up drivel." So it's almost like, in a sense, that Let Down is kind of like a cynical riposte of in a certain sense, Let Down's kind of like a cynical riposte of the, desire to escape that's in Exit Music. But also, it's kind of like, it's a weird kind of triumphant fatalism in this song. Like, it's really difficult to ascribe the exact kind of emotional tone of it, because the way I felt about the song has shifted a lot over the years. And part of that had been to do with the fact that the emotional tone of the song has been kind of difficult for me to exactly pin down. Like it's despondent, and there's a lot of really kind of like dark and upsetting lyrical imagery in this song. Some of it's quite on the nose as well. And then it gets to this second part of the song where the song starts to ascend, and Tom starts singing lines like, "One day I'm going to grow wings, a chemical reaction, hysterical and useless." And I mean, obviously the idea, the line like, "I am going to grow wings," is this really, powerful idea of ascending and floating above the literal garbage heap of animal corpses and trash that he's described in the song. But also then following it with a chemical reaction is kind of like, you've turned this into a kind of mutation, like the world has changed you in this way where it's made you into a kind of monster. So it's this weird sort of paradoxical idea here. And the idea that, yeah, I might grow wings, but I will remain hysterical and useless. On the face of it, I want to interpret this song in a kind of like twisted, optimistic way, especially because of the way that it soars towards its climax. But I don't really know how I feel about it. I know how I feel about it because I love it. Like, this is one of my favorite Radiohead songs, and spoiler alert, this is my favorite song on the album. But I don't know how I feel about. I don't know how it makes me feel. Really, it's a weird cocktail of emotions. Another thing worth noting is that I think this is one of the most, in terms of the arrangement, it seems simple, but there's a real kind of off-kilter nature to it, which is partly due to the fact that the main arpeggiated guitar line on this track is in 5/4 time, and the rest of the song is in 4/4 time. So it creates this kind of discontinuity between the guitar and the rest of the song. And so, yeah, it's this weird sort of ballad about being, and I think that reflects the idea of the song. It's this weird sort of ballad about being kind of out of step with the world, kind of torn down by it and floating through it, lifeless. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's a pretty cynical interpretation of it, but I'd love to hear what you guys think and if you guys feel any differently to me.
One thing, not so much lyrically, but more instrumentally, that strikes me about this song is, well, of course, first, the polyrhythm in it, the guitar in 5/4, the rest in 4/4. That's pretty neat. But also, what I think is the sound conjured up here really does precede and inspire a lot of sounds I think you would hear later incorporated in a lot of post rock, especially that those very dissonant guitar parts being placed together. That's very classically post rock. I love how that sounds. And I mean, it helps that the song lyrically is, you know, absolutely soul crushing. This the listlessness I think it captures is so powerful in a sense. I like the idea of like comparing oneself to just a bug. I like particularly a caterpillar, where you have that potential to become something great but get squashed out, so what feels so prematurely. It's a sentiment that's hard not to relate to. I think it feels so universal in the way that idea is expressed. I really I thought Let Down really was a highlight here.
I completely didn't make the connection between the bug idea and the growing wings. Like, yeah, caterpillar cocooning, that's so clearly a continuation there. But I do still think that the mention of a chemical reaction kind of complicates that. I like the kind of coexisting ideas of actually growing and ascending the world and being kind of mutated and boiled up by
Yeah,
it.
no, absolutely. I mean, I think back to actually, and this is a weird connection, but it reminds me of, there's a particular parasite that exists in a lot of ponds in Southern California that causes frogs to grow extra legs and basically mutates them horrendously. Interestingly, it's a parasite that exists more commonly now than ever because of global warming and man-made golf courses and connecting so many smaller pools into one larger thing. So in a sense, I think, while tangential, that's kind of the idea. It's that chemical reaction is evoking for me.
Mm. I mean, I've kind of danced around it as well, but like, I'm surprised I haven't mentioned it yet. But I do think that this song has one of the most elating and emotional climaxes of any piece of music that I've ever heard in my life. From the moment where the song kind of like, it has this real dourness to the first half of it, right? Like, it's really just writhing in that ugliness. And then these lovely, like, electronic arpeggiations come in towards the middle of the track in concert with the like electric guitar, and it's like these electronic textures that kind of fizzle into the song. And then, the verse comes in again with you know where you are, and it's fucking just goosebumps moment, right? When, because there's a real sense of, he's gone from early in the song where he's kind of singing like disappointed people clicking onto bottles, and then he gets to that point in the song and there's a lift in the animation of his voice. It's not that he's like totally triumphant, but that he's rising up, and whether it is in this positive or negative way, depending on how you want to interpret it. And again, whether you interpret it as this positive or negative thing, whether you interpret it as this transcending the horribleness, or whether you just interpret it as lashing out, when his vocal rises up to the point where he's just like hollering one day, and you know where you are in that falsetto over and over and over and over and over again, the way the song is built to that point, and then the way that Tom hammers that vocal, it's just it's one of those once in a generation musical moments for me. Like I've heard this song, not exaggerating, probably over 100 times, and it still doesn't lose any of that impact. And yeah, for me, it is the crown jewel of this record. It is almost the centerpiece, but in many ways one of the songs that encapsulates the darkness and the transcendence of this record.
I love, Tyler, that you mentioned the lyrical theme sort of being at odds with itself within the song, almost on a line by line basis sometimes. I think to me overall the song is about not knowing how to feel, just being stuck in a moment of stasis. It feels that life is sort of passing you by while you've been standing in one place. Tom has said that it was inspired just by being on the road all the time in this stage of life. First verse in particular, taking off and landing, the emptiest of feelings. It's caught somewhere between hopeful and desperate. And I think part of that on a sort of meta level is like dealing with the fact that at this stage in their career, Radiohead had gotten what they wanted. They wanted to be one of the most famous bands in the world. In a sort of more metaphorical way, it's just the old adage of you got what you want, but it wasn't how you pictured it to be. And so now you're trying to reconcile the emotions of, this is what I wanted, and I feel like I should be happy about it, but I'm not, because I'm now in this. I'm never settled into one place, and I'm away from home all the time, and you know, where you are. I think what helps that metaphor a little bit is the don't get sentimental, it always ends up drivel, where it's like if I write directly about this, it might cheapen that emotion, as from the writer's perspective. And it just, it's from a purely instrumental standpoint, it's like the most breathtakingly gorgeous shit I've ever heard in my life. Like the one day I'm gonna grow wings line, where he says the one day, and then Tom overdubs his own voice on there, and one of them hangs on the word day, and the other continues with the stanza, and it's just fucking, yeah. I mean, God knows how many times I've heard this song, and that moment just as one piece of a tapestry of one of my favorite songs ever. That moment, it just never has even come close to losing its luster.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise, I think, considering all that we've said, that this is a real fan favorite Radiohead song as well. Like a lot of people, a lot of Radiohead fans that I've seen online consider it as one of their greatest songs too. So yeah, it's just it's something else. And now I think it's time to talk about the second single for the record, and maybe the other. I guess there are kind of three big singles on this album that are three of the most enduring and songs in terms of the popular consciousness. And the second of those is Karma Police, which is, I think this was either this or No Surprises was like the first Radiohead song I can specifically remember hearing. This is a interesting song. Like it's most famous for the fact that the piano melody in the chorus very clearly interpolates the melody of the Beatles' Sexy Sadie. But I mean, it's cool incidental detail, but there's not really much more to say than that about it. But this is a song, again, it's kind of back into the Paranoid Android vein, actually. This song kind of speaks from a similar perspective there of being in a place where the people around you, the things that they're saying don't make any sense to you. And you're in a state where you're so kind of poisoned by the world around you that everything is kind of turned to noise, and everything is kind of turned to static, and everything, the stimulus, the stimulation of the world around you is kind of poisoning you slowly. Again, you get some of the more surrealistic lyrical approaches that color a song like Paranoid Android as well. And then you get this very sudden change of key and shift in the song in the outro, where it's like this narrator is suddenly snapping out of the fugue that they were in, or at least kind of convincing themselves that they're snapping out of the fugue that they're in. Because complementing that, one of my favorite instrumental details of the song is that Ed O'Brien distorts his guitar in the final minute of the song by kind of driving a delay effect into self-oscillation, according to Wikipedia. But anyway, whatever he does is he adds this effect where the guitar part, the electric guitar part, gradually becomes more and more this kind of swell of noise that rises and rises through the song until eventually it has corroded the entire track at the very end. And that's a beautiful little instrumental representation of the state of mind that the song presents, a kind of paranoia, but also a kind of like dulled emptiness, a kind of ennui that is a way of coping with the poisonousness of the world as well as a product of it. It's a really tortured song, that, and the way that it is structured within this reasonably, for this record, comparatively conventional structure. Until you get to that sudden change in the second half of the song anyway, is really interesting. The way that it kind of like puts you in a state of familiarity and comfort with the way that it starts, and then just pulls the rug towards the end.
I really like there's like these, I can't even describe if it's an instrument or some sort of edited vocal thing in like the end, where it's like you sort of
Like,
get that repeated line over and over again. Yeah, that's the one. And that sound like drives a wedge right into my head, and I'm just like, oh, fuck yeah. And
It's kind of
I'm
like
obsessed with how this.
It's kind of like a warped sort of parody of a like classic 50s or 60s pop song harmony, like a female harmony.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like it's
Yeah.
that, but it's kind of warped, and like with the backing vocal in exit music, it's warped and it's made into this kind of like alien or robotic thing, which is again in concert with the idea and the theme. So it's a nice little, again, this record is packed with those kinds of details that most bands wouldn't throw in, but add to the memorability of the song as well as complementing what it's about.
I also think that it's another song that, like some of the first ones on here, so perfectly build the idea of what people who inhabit this world are like, and the attitude they have. Like there's the one of the more interesting lyrics on the album is when it's like this girl's Hitler haircut, which fucking, like, I did not know that is what that lyric was until I listened to it with lyrics for like looking at them for the first time, and I was just like, motherfucker said what? But it's an interesting thing though, because when you look at that lyric, and it's like, I think the idea that Tom's sort of getting at is sort of the, well, I mean, like maybe he wasn't, maybe this is just sort of a particularly well-aged thing, but it's, I mean, we're very online people and we're on the internet a lot, and there's this sort of very mindless mob mentality attitude that a lot of people have when it comes to self-expression or art, where if something is vaguely transgressive, the instinct they have immediately is to, of course, berate it and to it's weird, it's gay, get rid of it. And like I feel like that's sort of the idea here, is that it's just like, oh, this, this haircut that's vaguely associated with this dictator that this person have, and then it's just like, oh, fucking, yeah, they're just trying to get at this like sanitization of society, to the point where it's like all of the edges are sanded off and everything is, plastic and inoffensive, to the point where it's like its own kind of warped aesthetic.
Something that's worth noting is that Tom has stated that the song is about having people look at you in a certain way, where they're kind of judging you or where they're just kind of resenting you. And specifically in the context of being in a workplace where you are kind of just anonymous and you're seen as kind of disposable. And when you do something that is vaguely, noteworthy in a way that isn't related to what you're there to do, you're kind of chastised. This notion of the karma police, like that's a joke that the band made up, the idea that, if you do something bad, the karma police will come and arrest you. And it's kind of like this idea of this character who is reacting against things around him that don't make sense or that don't square, and just kind of chastising that in that kind of ironic way. I love the description of the man who talks in maths, who buzzes like a fridge, who's like a detuned radio. Like, that's a beautiful way of describing, well, not beautiful, but it's like a really kind of stark way of describing like a lack of understanding, or like, being in a situation where everything is noise to you, or you aren't able to understand. This song, I think, is from the perspective of those people who are. I said earlier that I think the song is kind of about being unable to kind of understand the world, or kind of it all being noise. But in a certain sense, it's kind of like about people who are closed off from understanding. And when something happens, or when the world presents something that isn't a part of this neatly functioning, predetermined, prescribed way of being, then that has to be cast out and threatened. That's where the chorus, I think, comes from. This is what you'll get when you mess with us. And ultimately, that state of mind is a thing that brings its narrator to despair. I've given all I can, but we're still on the payroll. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting state of mind that's explored in this song, I think. So Fitter Happier comes next, and I like the way that it kind of immediately melts out of the destruction of the end of Karma Police. It like flows out of it perfectly. But what's interesting about this, I can't tell you where I read this. I'm sure I read it a long time ago, that the band briefly toyed with making this the opening track of the album, which I think is interesting. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like a thesis statement for the record. And I've seen basically any opinion you could possibly have on this song expressed. I mean, if you could call it a song, it is debatably an interlude, but I definitely think it has a place on the record. And I think that the way in which it goes about expressing the ideas of the record through these listing of various images, ideas, states of being, kind of like sanitized movie image things, is really quite effective and kind of really disturbing and unsettling. This idea of the robotized voice espousing these really kind of like fake ideas of it's very 1984-esque actually, and this is kind of like what you would imagine blaring from a loudspeaker in that world.
This is just what music sounds like in 1984.
Yeah,
You buy your records and you throw it on, and it just.
But what I like about it is that it's a mixture of those kinds of like fake shiny images of shot of baby strapped in back seat. You know, it's those kinds of images that are kind of very sanitized and fake. And then there's these like those are intermingled with these really disturbing images of things that are not sanitized and not okay. And it's this fusion of like, it's like you're existing in this world where everything is sanitized, this 1984-esque world where everything is presented in this way to, you know, appease and keep you seated. But the ugliness of what is really happening is bleeding through into that. And it's a really unsettling interlude. I play this record through. I don't find myself, I don't skip this track because I love listening to this album as an experience, but also I it is very difficult to listen to multiple times, not because I think it sounds bad. It sounds fine for what it is, and it fits the purpose of the record. And there's a lot of really awesome, eerie sound design elements to it that make it interesting as well. But it's just so depressing. I honestly think that this might be even more depressing than Street Spirit off of the last record for me, because there's just so much relentless ugliness in this song, and it's so soul sucking that it really takes it out of me.
There's a discussion to be had about, the differences between, songs, interludes, blah, 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 blah. But I've always just really been fond of this particular track just because it's like you said, it is so crushing and despair inducing that it just communicates its emotions so effectively that it's like, I don't really have I don't really think that, like, when people dismiss things like this, and it's just like, this clearly has like a really solid core idea and contributes to the album in a way that, like, whether or not it makes it better or worse is up to your own judgment. But if you just try and like discount it without it, I think that's just not being fair. And I don't know. It's a very, the things that it says is that it could stumble into feeling cliche, or all these things that are very 1984-esque, is that it's like it could say all these things that are like really obvious. And what kills me about it is that I go back and read it and it's just like, these are so weird and specific. And in that weird specificity, it finds a strange humanity that it's communicating losing. Like the parts of that get me are no longer afraid of the dark or midday shadows, nothing so ridiculously teenage and desperate, nothing so childish, which I almost think is kind of like maybe like a self-aware jab of sort of like the way some of their songs like Creep or High and Dry were maybe perceived or talked about, in the sense that like this sort of sanitization that they're going for, and the themes and the aesthetics are, it's just like, oh well, if you want to strip something of all of its emotion, and if you want to take away all this, this sadness and angst and real pain that people go through,
And this is
well,
what you get.
this is the sort of thing that you get. And it's
Yeah.
like communicating that, but with this really stilted, robotic way. And I love the distorted electric piano that's just really sadly kind of plodding along. And it's got those weird moments where it's got like that ascending, like boom, 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 and then like echoes into the distance. And it's just got a lot of really interesting sound play. And also it's just fucking grim. The most, I think, memorable part of it being the no longer empty and frantic, like a cat tied to a stick, driven into frozen winter shit, calm, fitter, healthier, more productive, a pig in a cage on antibiotics. It's just like, that's so fucked. Like, God bless.
Like
Sequencing it after Karma Police too, I think, is a really good choice, just in terms of like, it's sort of Karma Police being about the deprivation of expression and individuality, and like just all of these things. And then it's just like, this is what it is when it's like stripped back. This is who you are when you're just like, all of these aesthetic, personable, and human things are gone.
Yeah, I don't know about this one personally myself. I definitely understand a lot of the purpose it serves in the track list and why it fits in here. So I mean, I wouldn't discount it entirely, but I also do have the feeling at points where I'm like, yeah, but I get it. I get what the record is going for. And just having a Microsoft Linux program say it out to me, I don't know, doesn't really do it for me, but it's interesting, if nothing else. I would admit to its creativity as being something I would not just find on every dime a dozen album.
I think there's something to be said as well about a lot of the sentiments on this record. Not necessarily that the feelings on this record originated here, but that they have propagated so thoroughly outward from here that I can't imagine what it is like to approach this record, for the first time at this point when its influence is so saturated in so much art. Like yeah, you're right. Like this is very much on the nose, but it's also like on the nose in the way that a lot of art has been since then, but where this was, I guess, so much more fresh when it happened.
Yeah, and maybe that's a bit of what I'm getting at too. Of course, listening to this for the first time in 2021.
But hey, this is a record that is full of surprises and doesn't ever stay in one mode for long. And hence,
No.
we go into what is unarguably, I would say, across the internet, the most controversial song on this album. Which interesting. I'm interested to see where everyone. I think I know where Jake and Morgan fall on this song. But anyway, what's interesting about sequencing before we get into the next song is, okay, so you have this track, Fitter Happier, this kind of like sarcastic, kind of twisted polemic, this feed of dialogue that kind of bleeds in through the world that is being depicted. And then you have a different kind of polemic, a song from the perspective of a politician, Electioneering. And it's very much is a curveball because Tom has never outright taken on a perspective, this kind of perspective in the way that he does, this kind of wicked, cartoonish thing. And that's an aspect of this record as well that's not really talked about, is that Radiohead expressed a desire to try and undercut their seriousness and the dourness of this record where possible. And I think Electioneering is one of the ways of continuing and expressing one of its themes, and as well as being a bit more irreverent and kind of almost like parodic in a certain way. And that kind of goofier, more irreverent element of what the song is about lyrically is reflected in the instrumentation as well. You get Johnny with this riff that's like so gnarled and huge. You get this cowbell that comes into the song that adds this heat, this like real like clank to it, and the drums are so loud here and booming as well. And Tom is singing with this real kind of like rancid tone, and that chorus as well, like when I go forwards, you go backwards, and somewhere we will meet. The vocal, the progression there, the descending melodic line is so good, and the way the guitar kind of goes in concert with it, and kind of, it's awesome. It's a really good chorus. But yeah, this is a controversial song. A lot of Radiohead fans kind of hate this song, which I think is interesting. Like especially when you consider the fact that the sort of political ideas of this song, the specific critiques of voodoo economics and stuff, and this very kind of neoliberal world would become a pronounced theme in subsequent Radiohead records. But yeah, it's introduced here in this really kind of in-your-face ballistic way. And I'm very curious how the three of you will feel about it.
Cards on the table here. This is definitely the easy choice for my least favorite song on the album, but like hate is like not even that like I have like a fondness for this and can't understand people. Like it's just like if you like other songs on the record, it's just kind of like I just kind of expect that you would like this too. That just kind of makes sense to me.
Well, let's not get swept up in the extremities of it. People see it as a weak point universally. Like it's the aside from
Okay.
Fitter Happier, this is the only song on the album that doesn't have a bolded rating on Rate Your Music. So
Okay,
it's
well-
generally agreed by most people to be the weak point, although there are definitely some electioneering defenders out there. And I think the song's great. It's certainly not my least favorite on the record, even though I can completely understand why it would be. It's very kind of, like I said, blunt, in your face. But to me, that whole spirit of it and just the raucousness of it, it's so entertaining in a way that feels like a breath of life into the album at this particular point. Not that the album was flagging, but it shows the great ability of the band to sequence this record really, really well and to inject life into it at exactly the moment it needs to have that.
No, definitely. I think like the song is like, in my opinion, it's just fun. Like it's a really like raucous, really energetic track. I think if I had to point out the exact reason that it's my least favorite, it's not even like the thematic contribution that I don't like, or that it's like I don't find it instrumentally compelling, because I don't, and I do. I think it's a very good, very fun rock song. It's just that it's a little bit less forwardly atmospheric than the rest of the record, and it never, up until this point, like, again, this is obviously not a flaw or a dip or anything, but all the other songs, even if they do have a lot more energy, they don't ever sacrifice their ability to be very enveloping and very like cocoon you in this sort of iciness. And this song doesn't really have that, but like coming off the back of Fitter Happier, that kind of works as like a reintroduction. I think it's like this really fun, it's like a bit of a pace breaker in a sense, and like it's like you said, it's put in exactly the right spot. But it's just like, if you had to, like, you fucking force me at gunpoint to just be like, I mean, I guess this could be a little bit better in my opinion. It also doesn't really help that it's followed by like one of the other best Radiohead songs ever. But again, it's a great song. It's just, I don't find its ability to transport me to this world as effective as pretty much every other song on here, personally.
I do like the song, but I think its place in the album does strike me as a little strange. Like it's a little dramatic of a stylistic shift, and I guess a lot of this is fairly dramatic in how it changes around stylistically, but this in particular just, I don't know, it takes me a minute to get on board with it. And while I do like the song, I guess in a vacuum, in the context of the album, it just feels a little weird to me.
Okay. Well, that brings us to the next track on the record, Climbing Up the Walls, which I would wager to say is maybe the most unusual song on the album. To me, like one of the most unexpected, in terms of the fact that it is basically as far, I mean, we're excluding Fitter Happier here, but basically it is as far as removed from the kind of rock music that Radiohead were working within up to this point as anything. Obviously, it is a rock song. It features prominent electric guitar, but it has this kind of industrial tinge to it that's very alien at this point in the record. It has a real kind of creeping dread darkness to it. There's a very prominent bleeding bass synthesizer tone. The drums are very, again, industrial is a good way of describing them. They're just very kind of like distant and reverbed, and they sound like banging on a trash can, but in a good way, not in a Lars Ulrich way. But yeah, it is this song that is about kind of extreme paranoia. So this is a theme we've talked about a lot so far in numerous different songs. The sense of the nature of the world you're in, inducing a state of mind where you can't trust anything, and you find the stimulation of the world unbearable, and you retreat inwards. And it kind of frames that here in a more overtly horrific way, invoking a lot of really just disturbing and horrific imagery, and really kind of getting inside the head of the subject of the song. Well, although interestingly, this song is sung from the perspective, not in the perspective of the person in the song, but in the perspective of their paranoia and the perspective of their darkness, which is a really interesting approach for the track. A lot to be said about it. I'm very curious what you all think about this song.
Just unparalleled in atmosphere in terms of Radiohead's discography. I think one of the best produced and mixed songs on the album as well. It's very detailed. I love the sort of gently plucked acoustic guitars to match the lumbering fucking bass that forms the main melody of the song.
One thing I forgot to shout out that is arguably the most important aspect of this entire song, especially in terms of how it contributes to a growing way in which the band is developing, is the string arrangement on the song by Johnny Greenwood. Johnny Greenwood, we know today as this composer who is heavily influenced by real kind of avant-garde composers like Penderecki specifically, and it loves to incorporate string arrangements into his music, both with Radiohead and in his compositional work, that really adds to the drama and effect of whatever emotion is being conveyed in the given music. And this, I would say, is the first major point in the Radiohead discography where this starts to rear its head, and it gets more and more prominent in subsequent Radiohead records. He has, in this song, 16 different violins playing quarter tones apart from one another, in this dramatic, swooping instrumental element of the song that's kind of underpinning Tom York's vocal. And then at the climax of the song, which is just one of the most bone-chilling in all of kind of 90s rock music, where Tom's vocal, which incidentally has been so bizarrely treated in this song, like it's so kind of muffled and distant and really kind of, and I guess meant to kind of represent that inner voice inside someone rather than the actual voice of a person. And there's just a point where he just fucking screams, and the song just collapses into this pile of noise. Predominantly these strings, which have been so like melodic throughout the song, but just end up in this place in the last minute of the song where they're just kind of hanging there eerily. And it's such a disturbing development in the song, and I fucking love it. This is also one of my favorite songs on the album.
With this song, I thought of one particular reference point in terms of its sound palette, not really to anything that inspired it, but more to something that it most definitely inspired, that being the Mars Volta song Televators.
Oh shit.
Which I was immediately reminded of when I first listened to this. Of course, there's evident differences, but that connection I found really interesting, more to establish the idea of just how far-reaching Radiohead and their just sonic ideas are. And that reference point really kind of, I guess, for me, put into context just how foundational a lot of what they're doing is, and this song in particular being like this interesting, creepy, haunting sounding song that just has a great way of getting under your skin in like a really good way, with York's vocals being so like ear splitting and uncomfortable to listen to. I rather enjoyed it.
So I love the way this song ends in this really eerie, suspended state. In fact, one of my favorite, song cuts, like transitions or whatever you want to call it, from one song to the next ever in any album, is the way that Climbing Up the Walls ends and then No Surprises starts. Climbing Up the Walls ending with this suspended, eerie, dissonant note that's just held for a really uncomfortable amount of time and just kind of fades gently out into the silence. and then the gentle twinkling guitar tone of No Surprises coming in is really funny. Like it's amusing, and it's fitting because No Surprises is a perfect example of a song that is kind of has an ironically upbeat instrumental, essentially, that is, well, not upbeat, but like ironically pleasant and gentle sounding instrumental, because it is unequivocally one of the most devastating songs on this album and that Radiohead have ever recorded, I would say.
Oh yeah.
It is this.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was either Karma Police or this, because I was a kid, but I'm pretty sure this might have been the first Radiohead song I ever heard. I remember when I listened to OK Computer for the first time and I was like fucking 13 or whatever. I got to this song, I was like, oh, I know this song immediately. And that was a real surprising moment. But anyway, it has this. Oh, I forgot to mention earlier when we were discussing Karma Police that music video is directed by Jonathan Glazer, incidentally, famed director of beloved movies like Under the Skin. But
it is.
No Surprises also has a music video, an iconic music video, I would say, and one of my favorite music videos of all time too. It's elegantly simple and it is heartbreaking. And it is, I mean, viewers will know, but I'll summarize it in case. It is this video. It is this just a single shot of Tom York's head inside an astronaut's helmet that is slowly filling up with water. And eventually he is almost completely submerged, and then suddenly the water drains out and he kind of like gasps for air. And it's in a very emotional video, and it's beautifully simplistic and evocative of the idea of this song, which is, you know, the suffocating tiredness of existence, basically. Like it is just like the wearying, crushing feeling of being alive. Like we've talked about so many of the emotions that Tom and the band communicate about living in this world: the paranoia, the fear, the frenzy, the desperation. And this is the just genuine resigned sadness that underpins all of it. It's even more resigned and despairing than Let Down, because at least that song kind of reaches for some transcendence, whereas this song just kind of exists lilting in this state of suspended animation, and it is fucking devastating. It comes at a perfect point on the record too, especially following the frenzied, you know, panic attack of climbing up the walls. And I think it is one of the most iconic songs the band have ever released.
Well, earlier I said that Airbag was a song where I heard it and I was like, wow, this is better than everything else they've done. And then No Surprises came on and I was like, well, fuck me. Eh?
Damn right. Damn right.
That's
This
a banger pick.
I found myself so overwhelmed just by the description of feeling so done with it all. Just that the beauty in that, with contrasting that bleakness with the bells and whistles, was just such a powerful experience that I vividly remember the first time I listened to this. And the second time I had to pause the album and walk away for a minute, because it is simply just such an overwhelming track. That the final cry of no alarms and no surprises, and then the please at the end of that, is soul rending. It's just I don't want to come off like a fool by rambling for too long about this, because it's just a song that even in the moments where they're like where they say in the first verse, bring down the government, they don't speak for us. Even something like that is such a powerful, delicate sentiment where just the defeatism and acceptance and everything, all the emotions wrapped up in Tom York's voice in that one line is so it makes everything where I said about electioneering, where it's like, oh, that's such a simple song, and this does that in like 2 lines and breaks my heart. So yeah, it gets good marks from me.
I mean, yeah, it's a really captivating song, and I think it just sort of captures the sort of resigned acceptance, and I think the next track really feeds into that very well at this point. Like it comes at the perfect point on the album, and it's just like, structurally speaking, it's a great little like addition, and it's just that perfect mix between, like, it's definitely not one of the more like heavy songs on the album, but it's like just aside, like it's a little bit more than like electioneering in terms of like how like ornamental it is and instrumentally interesting it is, but it is mainly carried by its really vivid and really stark lyricism. And yeah, it's a fucking fantastic song.
Well, that brings us to the final single of this album that we're going to be discussing, although I think it was the third single, but the last single that appears in the sequence of this record, Lucky, which is an interesting song. This was the first song recorded for the album. It was actually recorded in 1995, over a year before the rest of the album was recorded. So it's a song that they had banging around since the Benz age. But I think it's fair to say that the way that the song is performed, even if it is one of the more kind of conventional rock sounding songs on the record, has this real hugeness to it, the spaciousness to it, that I think some of the tonalities and atmosphere in this very much calls back to the space rock elements introduced early in the record. And also the thematic idea of this song echoes the idea of Airbag as well, this rebirth and this kind of
Pull me out of the crash.
automobile accident, specifically an airplane crash in this song.
If I may say, the sort of references to the crash, I think this really does a lot of thematic heavy lifting, sort of tying back into the idea of the crash before, but it also ties back into the idea of growing wings and flying. But instead of a more like organic idea of like growing wings like an insect might, you know, it's a mechanical thing. You're relying on the support. But I think it's interesting that the placement here is, it sort of does imply that the sort of cyclical thing that we were getting at earlier, where I think it's sort of meant to be like, you sort of see a window into this world, how it operates, what it's like, what the people are like, how it feels to experience all of these things. And then it sort of recontextualizes the initial kind of pseudo-triumphant nature that Airbag presents, where, you know, you get pulled out of the crash and whatnot, but it's like, this time it's like, oh, the technology saved my life, but I have to go back into the world. And this sort of latter half of the album, I think, is definitely the bleaker half. And to me, it's always asking that question of just like, well, is survival really the avenue for our protagonist here, or is death actually the greater solace that we're looking for here? Because, you know, it might be better than existing in a place like this forever. We don't really know. And I think that sort of question being left in the air is kind of like a powerful sort of statement to make, coming full circle after you've seen and heard all of these things.
I find it to be one of the most interesting musically, although it is one of the more straightforward. I found the chord progressions really fascinating and strange. And as far as the guitar goes, I think this is one of the most compelling tracks.
It has a great fucking awesome kind of guitar solo moment where you expect the vocals to come back in, but they don't, and the guitar just kind of bellows into the song, reiterating the kind of core melodic motif of the track. That's an awesome moment musically.
Oh, I forgot about the chorus of vocals that are playing in sort of the background of that part. That does so much for the atmosphere there.
Yeah, it's like an audio equivalent of the kind of like being lifted up, like the narrator is talking about being lifted out of this air crash and triumphantly yelling that I've survived, in a way that could, be sort of ironic or delusional. Well, that leads us directly into the closing track of this record, The Tourist, which I will say from the bat is one of the biggest growers on this album for me. Like, it used to be my least favorite track, but I've come to really appreciate the way that it brings the album full circle. So obviously the album opened with this automobile crash like happening instantaneously as the album roars to life. And this song, obviously the lines of where the hell am I going at 1,000 feet per second, and perhaps not literal, but it's this idea of moving so quickly in the world that disaster feels inevitable, and it creates this sensation of suspended panic. And it's really beautifully complemented by the slowness of the arrangement, right? Like, it's suspending you in this moment of genuine, fear and genuine loss of control.
I just find it really compelling compositionally outside of that. And as a closer, it's really, I think it's kind of like just all of the album in one song in a lot of ways. It's a little bit scary sometimes. It's gorgeous all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you mean. I don't really feel that it's anticlimactic. I mean, because it has this real kind of surging like part towards the end of it where everything kind of comes together, and it's this beautiful climax that I think stands in as a good climax for the rest of the album. But it does utilize a kind of more measured pace building up to that gives it a lot of effect, but also stands in contrast with a lot of the rush of the album, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think of this and Lucky as sort of being at peace with each other. I think this is like a continuation of what that's doing, sort of like the vehicle that you're in and then like still going anyway, but on like a more personal level, I guess. And I think that the sort of thing that it conveys to me is sort of a microcosm of what exit music does, where it could be either the most triumphant or the most like downer thing that happens on the album of like traveling this fast. It's like, are you traveling to escape? Are you traveling just, like you said, like through life and just kind of going through the motions and just sort of experiencing this over and over again? Because the album has that sort of cyclical like winding kind of spiral thematically speaking anyway to it. So it's just like it could be an escape, and the escape itself could be futile, or it could just be going through it all again. And you don't really know. And I feel like it's just sort of something that really gains on meaning once you've like had this record, at least in your life, for like a while, I think, just because depending on where you are with it, you can sort of read into this song as being a song that might be full of hope or that might be full of futility, and it might make you feel completely different depending on where you are in life. And it's just like that sort of weird tone that it has is just sort of like on the edge of being like, maybe it's scary and ominous, maybe it's faintly hopeful, maybe it's something, but it's just like it feels like it's designed to sort of cater to the like wherever you kind of feel inclined at any given moment, it could sort of steer you that way. And I think that's sort of the magic of OK Computer as a whole, of like immersing you in this world and then sort of having everything be what you personally make of all of it. And it's just sort of a perfect synecdoche for how you feel about the world and confronting a lot of these different problems and like societal ills and connections or lack thereof with people. And it's just it's a terrific song. I can definitely see why it could underwhelm some, but for me personally, it is absolutely 100% seconding the biggest grower on the album notion. One of my favorites on here.
To me, I think the title, The Tourist, is rather important. This idea of not like really resting or staying somewhere, but more being a passing visitor. And in a sense, that is, yeah, like a microcosm for existence and life itself, and the idea of slowing down and taking your time with things rather than rushing through everything is, to me, a really central and important centerpiece to this record thematically. And of course, yeah, interesting that this is the last song, and this being where that sentiment is expressed, I think adds a lot of purpose. Because yeah, in a sense, while it is a bit of a weird, I guess, kind of anticlimax moment, I wouldn't make another song the closer. I think this is the one I would pick if I had to sequence this.
Agree.
Yeah, and so it really ends the record on a bittersweet and beautiful, and I think, like you say, Jake, emotionally ambiguous note. And it's, I wouldn't have it any other way. I completely agree. And that is the journey of OK Computer, the twists and turns and the emotional whirlwind that this record takes you on, the ambitious branching out into all these different explorations of the possibilities of what Radiohead can do. And so before we wrap this discussion up, we thought it would be awesome to just talk briefly, as we did with the last couple of episodes, about some of the supplementary material for this record, because this album has a lot of B-sides. The Airbag EP came out alongside this album, which featured a number of songs that are now also included on the second disc of the 2017 20th anniversary reissue. That reissue also included 3 new songs that had never been heard before. They had been played live in certain points, and they were kind of like demos and bootleg recordings, but they'd never been officially released. And those 3 songs came each with an individual music video that the band shot specifically for those songs. Those tracks were I Promise, Man of War, and Lift. Lift especially being a very highly anticipated song when Radiohead announced that they were going to be releasing it. It's a fan favorite bootleg for the 2 decades that it wasn't heard, but now it is. Interesting insights into Radiohead's exploration of their sound in this era, right? Like Man of War and Lift specifically are more conventional sort of rock songs that are more kind of in keeping with what they were doing on the bends, but each also has a kind of intricacy to it that elevates it above the template of the bends. Like Lift in particular has like a really kind of off-kilter arrangement to it, even though it has this soaring chorus that I absolutely love. Man of War is this just fantastic rocker of a track that kind of balloons to this enormous string swelled chorus. It definitely feels of a piece with certain parts of OK Computer. Those of you who have heard any of those specific songs that they released in 2017, what do you guys think of those tracks?
Yeah, I gotta back your sentiment with Man of War. Man of War is one of my favorite Radiohead songs, point blank, period. I will not lie. If you took Man of War and replaced Electioneering, kind of think OK Computer would be a better album. Just, throwing that shit out there.
Songs that are about similar themes, so I can definitely see where you're coming from there.
And it just accomplishes the same thing musically, kind of like that fucking, like that really heavy second half with that guitar is just like, it gives me what Electioneering does.
I don't necessarily agree with you, but I also don't necessarily disagree, because I certainly like Man of War more than I like Electioneering. I recently remade my top 20 Radiohead song list, and this is one of my top 20 favorite Radiohead songs. Of these first 3 on the OK Not OK half, I Promise also made it on to that list because I think that's just one of Radiohead's most straightforwardly beautiful and endearing tracks, which is kind of rare to see. And I love it.
I want to shout out Meeting in the Aisle as having a very strange coalescence of kind of a space rock thing and also kind of an IDM thing going on with the drumming on this. It feels like a very strange intersection of Kid A and OK Computer, and I think it's really like indicative of maybe where the band would take their sound. So I think that's an interesting track to point out.
It's an interesting shout. A really overlooked track from the Airbag EP. It's one of the rare Radiohead instrumentals, and
Yeah,
I
it's a good one too.
definitely dig that song. I think the highlight of the Airbag EP, which is the songs that aren't the first three on the second disc of the reissue, is Polyethylene, which is this huge multi-part. It's only 4 minutes, but it's this multi-part huge song that has this soaring guitar crunching like climax that's so huge, and it just like, again, it has that similar sort of sense of the guitar grandiosity of a track like Man of War. I'll go back a step and say I alluded to the song Lift as well. I really love that song. It's kind of less, sort of in your face than Man of War, but it's kind of really beautiful as well. And the sentiment of that song, I think that song would really have fit on OK Computer, although I wouldn't have put it on the record, but it would have fit if they had put it on. It's just a real kind of soft sadness to that song, even though it does have its own kind of soaring quality that I absolutely love. It's lyrically one of some of my favorite lyrics of this whole era as well. Some of the other B-sides I'll shout out because I spent a lot of time. The Airbag EP is one of my favorite EPs ever. And I think the song Pearly is great too. It's this real kind of like, it's almost alt-rocky, and it has this really kind of like vocally rising climax. I love that track too. Palo Alto is a particular highlight of the Airbag EP too, because it's so unlike any other Radiohead song, except for maybe Electioneering, weirdly enough. And I only say that in the sense that both of these songs have these incredibly loud guitar parts that kind of just really ring out, and there's like a loud quiet dynamic on that song that's really just strange for Radiohead. And it's like this song about, like this living in LA in this kind of like plastic neighborhood. And it's really irreverent and funny. Like, it definitely shouldn't have been on an album, but I also think it's a really good song that should be heard by fans of this era. It's just really kind of a cool curveball. Another song on the Airbag EP I love is the song A Reminder, which is more measured and slow and kind of mournful, but it also really gets me. Just a great series of tracks on those on that second disc of OK Not OK. That's totally worth checking out if you're into the material on the record proper or the record this era of the band. Totally.
Second half of OK Not OK might even be a worthwhile addition to, like, if it was a Radiohead album, it might be better than several canonical Radiohead albums.
I get what you're saying. I disagree only because it doesn't add anything to the Radiohead discography, but I get what you're saying. There's a lot of great songs on it. And
it's better than fucking Pablo Honey.
Oh yeah, no, you're okay. That's definitely true.
It's better than Amnesiac.
All right, let's move into our favorite tracks.
Not gonna set the world on fire right now.
Let's move into our favorite tracks and ratings for OK Computer. Jake, why don't you go first?
3 favorite tracks. I will say Exit Music for a film. I'll shout Subterranean, Homesick, Alien, because that one needs a little bit more love. And Climbing Up the Walls. Least favorite track is Electioneering. OK Computer was my favorite Radiohead album for a very long time. Was my favorite album for a long while. Still one of my favorites. And while not a perfect album, I justify my score by saying that I love OK Computer about as much as I am capable of loving any album. So it gets a hard 10 from me.
Favorites from me are Airbag, Let Down, and No Surprises. Least favorite, Lucky. I'm giving it a 7 out of 10.
My 3 favorites are Let Down, No Surprises, and either Climbing Up the Walls or Airbag. I'm probably gonna say Airbag, but maybe not. I don't know. It doesn't matter. We all die anyway someday. What the fuck does it matter? No least favorite. Fucking 10.
My three favorite songs are, Let Down, Climbing Up the Walls, and Airbag. It's a 10 out of 10. So, that gives us an average rating of 9.3, which I think, it's pretty fucking good for OK Computer
Yeah.
from this podcast. And so that was OK Computer, and we will be diving into the very strange world of Kid A week from now, so stick around for that. But in the meantime, let us know what you think of OK Computer, what OK Computer means to you in the comments below. Do you think we missed any important interpretations or information when talking about these songs and what they're about? Please let us know in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Make sure you follow us on Twitter if you're not already at JamsTPod. Links in the description. That is also our Instagram handle as well. Make sure that if you haven't already, you've subscribed to the channel and liked the video. Check out our other videos as well. We review new releases every Sunday. We just reviewed this past Sunday the new albums from Tyler the Creator and Lucy Dacus. We had great conversations about those. Lots of other content on the channel. Please check it all out and see if anything interests you. And we will be back same time next week to talk about Kid A.
And as always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Pokemon, gotta catch 'em all.